Hi, everyone. So I'm going to talk a little bit about how disinformation gets amplified and how we have new technologies that are amplifying these threats to voters exponentially. As you guys know, online disinformation plays a really key role in voter suppression, and we're going to talk a little bit about today about what's relevant this cycle. All right. So with voter suppression, intimidation, and disinformation, I've been born and raised here, lived here my whole life. We saw different ways in which this like was executed. For me, growing up, I vividly remember the 1990 Harvey Gantt TV ad in his white hands. I heard about flyers being dropped around disinformation, but with social media and technology, we're seeing, different ways in which these new threats are evolving and being amplified. Obviously, with social media, there is fast transmission at no cost. We're seeing builds on like amplifies division, inequality, racism, anti-Semitism, white supremacy, patriarchy, ableism, all of that. We're seeing a way they kind of utilize the enemy's frame and in a negative partnership, and contribute to the radicalization by like stoking fears of a multiracial democracy and tying it to election disinformation, and then creating conditions where violence is acceptable, and it's not. All right. So we're going to talk a little bit about narratives and themes. So we've seen kind of an overarching narrative around like time, place, manner of the election. That's, we've seen all of that. The big one in 2016 was text to vote. You can't text to vote, obviously. We're seeing ways in which they kind of tackle trust in the process or outcome of our elections. We see parts about illegal voting or unsolicited ballots. We've seen conversations around law enforcement at the polls that creates voter intimidation, administrative errors or unintentional suppression. All right. So I'm going to talk a little bit. I'm going to go through a couple examples between 2020 and now about how online disinformation becomes offline problems. Now, 2020, we saw the rise of these Stop the Steal Facebook groups. They kind of evolved out of these COVID response reopen groups that we were seeing evolve in the fall of 2020. And then they kind of flipped to being like these Stop the Steal movement groups. And we saw them across the country. And unfortunately, this kind of seeded the ground for the January 6th attack on our country. So, that's just a very clear example about how online amplification, social media, new technology created a real life threat. Next slide. Next one, we're going to talk a little bit about 2022 here in North Carolina. We saw the rise of what we call door to door voter harassment. We saw an evolving voter fraud narrative online. We saw these kind of groups evolve, like North Carolina America's Audit Force was particular. This was an article about how these individuals, voters in Brunswick County, North Carolina, they were harassed at their home because they wanted to see if this 100-year-old man was really still alive and really did vote. And that's voter suppression. That is strictly how an online problem becomes direct voter intimidation. This cycle, what we're seeing is kind of this evolution of the anti-immigrant hate rhetoric, lies about immigrants and voting, but it really kind of stems from 2016, 2017, when Trump advanced a false claim that 3 to 5 million people voted illegally in the 2016 election. That was not true. This kind of has evolved into what we see as these kind of only citizen voting coalitions. We have a bill in Congress called the SAVE Act. And what it has evolved to here right now, what we're facing in North Carolina is we're seeing various signs pop up and direct voter intimidation at polling locations here in North Carolina. And that all came from like an online amplified narrative. All right. So again, we're going to some of the key challenges here in North Carolina are indirect and direct voter intimidation. We're seeing, challenges from Hurricane Helene and FEMA and distrust in the government and distrust in the election process. And I would be remiss not to point out at this point, like how we saw those Stop the Steal groups evolve from like Reopen and COVID kind of groups. We're starting to see some groups on social media evolve to, challenge Hurricane Helene and the trust in our government. And we are watching those groups post election to see if they engage in nefarious actions. All right. So we also want to point out the significant kind of the growth of the percent of users who see untrue content every time or almost every time they engage in a platform. Obviously, we see Facebook and TikTok really high. And we also want to note that some of the biggest sources of disinformation are social media feeds, followed by like community messaging apps on down. We also want to talk a little bit about how simplified social media and online platform response policies. There's a whole lot of really bad content out there. As someone who's been tracking this for over 4 years, we see a lot. But there's only a small percentage of it that's actually actionable content that violates the platform's community standards. And even at that, even if we agree that it violates the community standards, there's only a very, very tiny bit that they will actually take down or flag. So what do we do? Where does this leave us? So we want to talk a little bit about how we respond to this effort. What we've moved toward here in North Carolina is doing more proactive voter education. We talk a little bit about flooding the zone with pro-voter content, but we also want to continue fighting voter suppression by flagging mis and disinformation and counting deceptive practices. So right now we're having people report to the National Report Disinfo tip line. That goes into a project called Junkopedia, where we can go and see everything in the back end and handle it. This is led by Common Cause National. And lastly, I'm going to point you to some key resources here in North Carolina. First, I want you to check out ncvoter.org. It is your one-stop shopping for good voting information. Next, if you see anything, and it either in direct voter intimidation or online, please report it to the Report Disinfo tip line, or if it's like in person, please call our hotline 888 our vote. Thank you so much, Jesse, for having me.